And I also was offered an opportunity to go and do some consulting work in two large London boroughs. So I combined those and did a bit of research into the use of restorative justice and mediation in two large London boroughs. And wow, I mean, having learned about the corrosive nature of conflict within communities, I thought workplaces would be different, warmer, more pleasant, more dignified, more respectful. And I held my head in my hands again and saw the insidious and corrosive nature of bullying, harassment, discrimination in the workplace. And really, you know, at the time in the early 2000s, and arguably things haven't necessarily moved a lot, although they have to some extent, the woefully ineffective systems for resolving this stuff in the workplace. And I've got the bit between my teeth, saw a massive opportunity for mediation and restorative justice within organisations. And the next 20 years has been a real whirlwind of helping organisations to adopt mediation. In the first instance, to have a mediator parachute into a dispute and help find solutions, which obviously would be great to talk about. But you haven't got to do many mediations before you start looking at managers and HR and others and leaders that go, come on, what are we doing to our people? How are we handling people that they get into such a difficult and adversarial and positional situation, which is so damaging and so harmful, without any systems and processes being put in place to act in a more transformative, transformational, proactive, predictive way to resolve this stuff. So the last 10 years of my work has been working upstream with HR managers and leaders to start asking these questions. And the good news is, and there's a lot of good news, people are starting to realise that changing our systems, processes, the culture of our workplaces can act as a really powerful antecedent to better relationships and better quality conversations in our workplaces.
That's fantastic. You've mentioned the phrase restorative justice. I mean, that was when I started talking to you, that was the phrase that I sort of cottoned onto. And can you tell us a little bit, what is restorative justice and you know, how does it apply in these situations?
So let's think about it firstly in contrast with the prevailing system of justice, which I would call retributive justice. I would call it is retributive justice. So our justice systems, which permeate through our society and are deeply ingrained into our organisations, are based on a principle that there must be someone who's at fault. So we need to identify who's at fault in order to be able to punish the individual. And retributive justice systems require a punishment which fits the crime. So there's a balance of probability in our workplaces, 50 plus 1%. You've undertaken an action which has caused harm, and there will be a punishment. And of course, in the workplace, the punishment is dismissal. Restorative justice, in contrast, is about identifying what the harm is, what the cause of the harm is, what the impact of the harm is, and presenting an opportunity for the person who created the harm and the person who's been harmed to come together to establish and understand what happened, why it happened, in a compassionate, supportive, open environment, to draw out, and I think it's really important, three really key elements. The first one is insight. Why did it happen? How did it happen? The next one is understanding. What impact did it have on me, on you, and on our situation? And the third one is, I think, where we start to see this linking into productivity and performance, is identifying then creative solutions to prevent that harm occurring in the future. So restorative justice is defined as being compassionate, empathetic, driven by insight and learning. But let's not pretend for 1 second it's a soft option. It's a tough option when we present each other with the real impact of our behaviour on another human being, rather than subcontracting justice to these broken systems and other tired paradigms which actually draw us apart rather than drawing us together. They build walls rather than build bridges.
And how does the notion of justice go down within organisations? When you talk about justice to HR directors, do they run a mile, or don't they see it as in their remit?
It's a fantastic question. If you think about, I mean, I've got young children, like many people listening to this. It's not fair is the first time that we hear a young person define a value or a belief. It's not fair. My brother's got this, my sister's got that. That's not fair. So our notions of fairness and justice are deeply ingrained in our sense of who we are as human beings and how we relate to other human beings. And we go through our lives with a very strong and palpable sense of fairness, of what's just, of what's fair, of what's equitable. We see that across our society. Yet in the workplace, no one seems to talk about justice. No one seems to understand justice. We default to this retributive blame, shame, and punish model of justice, which we say to our managers, go and deliver justice, but we never really give them the tools to do that. So what does a fair and just outcome look like for a manager who's maybe managing performance or managing change within their workplace? But when that manager engages in what I see as the two models of justice that happens in our organization, extensive inaction or expensive overreaction, because they're not sure how to act, we then defer or subcontract justice to these processes: discipline, performance, grievance, absence, capability, these big adversarial, retributive models of frameworks that we then say, okay, we'll ask you to go and deliver justice. But they don't deliver justice. They deliver retribution. They deliver blame, fear, betrayal, anxiety, uncertainty, harm, division. So when that breaks down, as indeed it does, we then look to then subcontract justice to our third stakeholder in the piece, our lawyers. And of course, the lawyers then see justice delivered as a model of reducing risk to the employer rather than a model of delivering a fair and just outcome. So what people say to me is they see justice as being an essential tenet, a core function of the organization, but they start to realize that they're subcontracting justice out to these three functions without having really truly considered what those notions of justice, fairness, inclusivity, and so on and so forth are about. And that's the big conversation that's happening in organizations, driven by social justice movements, climate justice, and this desire for us to have a much more transparent, open, inclusive model of justice within the workplace.
It's interesting. You would say that organisations are reactive in this sphere. They're not really leading the way.
Absolutely. I think that organisations are reacting to circumstances. We're putting fires out. I speak to many HR professionals. It feels like they're firefighting, constantly moving to respond or react to issues as they're occurring, rather than thinking about upstream what are some of the causes and some of the antecedents to these issues, and putting in place justice systems and models which could actually prevent, predict these issues. And as I said earlier as well, Stuart, it's not just, this isn't a moral or ethical feature of the organisation, although it is morally and ethically good to do this properly. I use the word creativity, innovation, insight, and understanding. It's the understanding, insight, and creativity that comes out of a conflict or a difficult conversation that actually then seeds competitive advantage. That's where the smart investors will go, the smart talent, the top talent, the smart customers. So how we deliver justice has a direct impact on the culture, which has a direct impact on the outcomes that the business is trying to achieve in terms of investment, talent, and customer retention.
So you said at the beginning that there is some good news, and there's lots of it. What does some of this look like? You know, with the sort of work you're doing, what can we see some progress, and who's doing it? You know, perhaps doing it well, or at least trying to do it better.
I think the organisations that are doing this well, and there are a large number from private companies. We do a lot of work in the banking sector. You know, I can talk about Aviva, who've gone for many awards and won awards for the wonderful work that they've been doing, who are starting to be courageous. I think it takes courage. I think we've become so used to the status quo. This is how the things are. We can't change them. And in some respects, there's been a lot of whispering in HR directors and chief HR officers and chief people officers' ears. You have to do it this way because it's legal compliance. It is not legally compliant to beat people up, destroy people's lives, cause harm, and cause injury to other people. And if there is a conflict that I'm seeing within the workplace, within organizations, the challenge is, are we going to be people-centered, purpose-driven, and values-based, or are we going to be legally compliant, risk-oriented, and damage relationships? And what I see in organizations, if people are really challenging that status quo, they're choosing person-centered, purpose-driven, and values-based. But what's really interesting, and I think it's being borne out in a great many organizations, is as they're approaching justice, conflict resolution, culture change, and so on and so forth, through that prism of purpose-driven, values-based, person-centered, it doesn't only mitigate the risk, it actually reduces the risk of problems down the line. We don't have to be retributive, adversarial, draconian, and punitive in order to mitigate risk in our workplaces. So the organizations, and I'm seeing it happening so much now, the organizations which have the courage to reject those old paradigms and do something new are the ones I think that are beginning to move forward in a really exciting way.
Please send in your questions for David at any time. Anna Nielsen has sent in a couple of points. She says, I wonder where you see the trend of restorative HR going, and what will leaders need to do to make it more widely used. And she also says, I love the idea of breaking workplace norms being less about a violation of policy and rules and more about a violation of the shared community.
Yeah. Wonderful. I think it's a rethink of the social contract, what binds us together. So, seeing some great work where unions, managers, and that triumvirate, unions, managers, HR, are coming together and rethinking some of those rules of engagement, moving away from adversarial and combative towards a more predictive, a more proactive, a more compassionate driven approach, and more in that collective relationship. See, in terms of the role of HR, I think they play a critical role. Every day I'm seeing people on LinkedIn now celebrating their new job as people and culture lead, people and culture partner, head of people and culture. There is a massive shift within the HR function to put people and culture first. Why do I think that's important? People are the business. Business partnering to me smacks of HR taking the side of the business in opposition to others within the company. And automatically, the phrase business partnering and the notion of business partnering to me is it creates a division. For me, it's a divisive term. If people are the business, then actually the development of HR as a people profession, as a people function, supporting people, celebrating their brilliance, helping to create an environment where we can help them to be the best versions of themselves, creating policies and processes which are flexible and agile, supportive, compassionate, engaging, detaching. And I know HR will have a view on this. They may not agree with what I'm saying, but the perception of a great money is that there's a paradox within the HR function. HR is a driver of strategy, of talent, of engagement, inclusion, employee experience, employee value proposition, employee branding. Brilliant, really strategic function for the HR. But the felt experience when I go knocking on the door of HR is I'm sucked into these draconian adversarial policies and procedures. And that's the felt experience of the workforce, but the perception is that HR is trying to be strategic. And what do we see there? How do we play that? What we see is there's a set of rules for the strategic function within the organization, which is governed and supported by HR. And there's a set of rules that I have when I have a problem in the workplace, which are going to cause me harm and distress. One set of rules for them, another set of rules for us. And somewhere in the middle, on the pivot of this, is the HR function. And it undermines people's perception of HR. And I don't think HR necessarily realize it's happening until they engage in a big listening exercise with people and start to have the courage to challenge. And HR sits in the center of this piece. One rule for them, another rule for us. Strategy versus the felt experience of retribution. And when HR are able to release themselves from that perception of being pulled towards management, recognizing that people are the business, developing a policy process framework, which is much more about resolution than it is around retribution, then we start to see, I think, the emergence of an incredibly powerful people and culture function. And that's happening right now in organizations around the world.
Well, that's exciting if it is. I mean, I can't help but echo what you're saying, because I mean, often HR is seen as they're seen as all about legal compliance. They're like the management's enforcers. It's like the police. It's like the secret police sometimes too. You have that sense, and people don't. I mean, fundamentally, people often don't trust HR. So that prevents them from being strategic or from achieving some of the other objectives that they might otherwise be bringing to the organization. But what can they do to change that? I mean, you say it takes a big listening exercise. How do you begin to reposition or convince people that there's real change happening here?
I think the first one is, I think with anything in our lives, whatever it might be, we have to acknowledge that there is a problem. And I just want to absolutely stress, this is not the HR person that's the problem. It's the HR and management systems that are being deployed that are the problem. So let's decouple the person from the problem. This is proper mediation stuff as well. The person's not the problem. The problem's the problem. So let's take an honest and critical assessment of our processes. Processes aren't everything, but it's the processes and policies which define the nature of our relationship with each other when the problems occur. So I think it's right we look at policies. Let's take our policies and let's use a little bit of neuroscience. We haven't got to be a neuroscientist to use a bit of neuroscience, but let's just take our policies. Let's take our standard grievance procedure, pick it off our intranet site, and let's do a little bit of neuroscience with it. Let's look at all of the parts of our grievance procedure which are releasing dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphin, those happy hormones that we know when we're together, we're connected, we have purpose, we have a higher growth mindset. And let's mark all of those parts of the procedure with our green marker pen. And with our red marker pen, let's look at all of the parts of the procedure which are likely to release cortisol, adrenaline, or any of those fight or flight hormones which are likely to introduce a defensive or an aggressive response from the participant. Let's use our red marker pen. Now, once we've gone through that process, let's take a look at that policy. And that policy, I can be pretty confident from the many that I've seen, will be entirely red with very little, if any, green. Now, we know that people are likely to have a high growth mindset. They're likely to engage with each other constructively. They're likely to listen, to hear each other when we're in a good place. But how do we get people into a good place? We listen to them. We engage with them as adults, as human beings, constructively. If the frameworks that we are deploying are like tipping a bucket of cortisol over your head, then the processes are broken. So let's take a step back. This isn't the HR is not the problem. The systems are the problem. Engage in critical analysis. Analyze using the tools you have available to you. Let's look at appreciative inquiry, positive psychology, nudge theory. Let's look at the behavioral sciences, all of those things which are really powerful drivers of change, and apply those to our HR systems. And then I think HR are coming back to me saying, yeah, we get this. We want to do it differently.
Tom O'Connor doesn't ask a question, makes a statement, which I think is kind of bearing out what you said, David. Tom says some organizations are entrenched in these systems and procedures, which increasingly convoluted, negative, time-consuming, and anything but beneficial for anyone. HR spending too much time in conflict and too little in developing and retaining people. And I suspect that is the reality in organizations, that HR are handling the conflict instead of revolutionizing the systems.
And what it seems to me to be such a shame to be so mired in transactional activity. We can't see the wood for the trees. In fact, we can't even see the wood for the trees. All we can see is the tree in front of our faces. And for many HR professionals, when I speak to them, I ask this question when I go in to do work with HR teams: why did you come into HR in the first place? What is it that drove you to be an HR professional? And people talk about getting the best out of themselves, aligning the needs of the organization with the needs of their people, all of this wonderful work. But when you ask people what the felt experience of being an ER specialist, an employee relations specialist, or an HR business partner, or an HR manager, it feels that those desire for transformation is overridden by the transactional nature of the organization. So I don't think it's Tom and I who are saying this. I think it's many an HR professional out there saying, you know something, we want to do something differently. But no one's saying, this is what I'm trying to do in the book, and what I'm trying to do is saying there is another way of doing this stuff. That is the good news I was referring to earlier. You know, where are our public policy? Where's our political leadership on this? Where's our public policy on this stuff? You know, we saw Michael Gibbons come in 2007 and review the then statutory disciplinary and grievance procedures. Everyone was crying out, it's common sense. We need to get back to basics, put people first. Nothing happened. Nothing changed. This is 15 years ago when we had the best quality public debate in our workplaces. And since then, we've seen the rise of alternative dispute resolution, known as ADR, alternative dispute resolution, across our civil justice system, our criminal justice system, our family courts, yet in our workplace and employment relations, it's been left behind. Again, it's such a shame, such a missed opportunity, and I'm really calling out for a substantive review of the way that we handle disputes through the employment tribunals, right the way to local policy management in our own organisations.
Gemma Bromfield says, this is fabulous. As an HR consultant, this is something I champion after seeing years of broken relationships at the hands of the old justice systems in place. I'm passionate to challenge the status quo. But I think the book is very much about sort of making the journey from the transactional to the transformational. Tell us a little bit more about that, how organizations can actually sort of begin to foster and create a transformational culture.
Yeah, thank you, Des. So in the text, I set out a model which I call the transformational culture model, and it offers three sort of broad component parts. The first one is what I call the transformational culture hub, which is a cross-functional collaborative body of people within the organization who own the organizational culture. And there's a big debate about who owns culture. Everyone, no one. Seems to be the greatest asset or the greatest liability in our organisations that no one has real ownership of, and finds it so difficult to shape. So the Transformational Culture Hub own the culture, and they will be responsible for delivering and deploying a transformational culture in the organisation, chaired by the Chief HR Officer, direct report and accountability into the board. So it's a direct board level function, bringing together key stakeholders. They will then be responsible for delivering the 8 enablers of transformational culture. So it's about putting purpose and values first, using our values as a golden thread through our organisation, mapping our organisation and embedding our values across the whole employee life cycle, from recruitment, induction, all of the policies, the systems, the processes, reward, benefits, and so on and so forth. Looking at the development of an evidence base, so using evidence-based practices within our organisations to drive the changes. So using and gathering data to drive the changes, and then continually monitor and evaluate and tweak the culture based on the amount of information and evidence coming through the organisation. Really powerful use, real-time use of data and analytics in the organisation. Repurposing the HR function, as I've mentioned, the development of the people and culture function. Integrating transformative justice, as we've been talking about, that procedurally sound restorative model of justice. Developing line management behaviours and line management capabilities and competencies to align those behaviours and competencies to the values and purpose of the organisation. A really powerful piece of work which sits as a centre point within the transformational culture. Considering the alignment of well-being, engagement and inclusion, and drawing data and metrics from well-being, engagement, inclusion to help us to really understand, again in real time, the employee experience and its relationship then to customer experience. So bringing in colleagues who are conscious and working together in this space around employee experience and customer experience, aligning those two functions. And also thinking about this as in terms of brand, reputation, risk, social justice and sustainability. So there's a number of enablers which sit within the model, which the hub would then be responsible for delivering. And the final component part of the outputs, what I would call the 7 dimensions or the 7 C's of transformational culture. And that's around courage, connectivity, common purpose, communication, and so on and so forth. It's about identifying those 7 C's and seeing those 7 C's as the outputs of a transformational culture, but also the inputs that feed back into it, because that's what our managers and leaders are delivering in terms of the felt experience of the work of the employee. So it's those 3 different elements: the hub, the enablers, and then those outputs and those dimensions. And that becomes the transformational culture model that's brought into the organisation, not as a prescriptive model. I think it's really important to stress this. It has to be flexed and flexible to meet the different needs and circumstances of each organisation. And that's, I think, where its real strength is it can be flexed to meet the needs of any organisation of any size, any geography, or any industry.
And does the element of geography confuse things even more and provide even more challenges? Because a lot of the stuff we've talked about, like a concept like fairness, it is viewed differently in different parts of the world. And similarly with culture, if you're in a global organization, actually managing it becomes ever more troublesome and difficult.
It does, but it presents a really great opportunity as well, Stuart, to begin having conversations and defining that term. I think the last thing people want is someone like myself coming in and being prescriptive on what those terms mean. What I think the transformational culture model does, and this sort of approach does, is it generates a really big conversation in our organisations about what these things mean. What are these values? What are these beliefs? What are these principles that connect us as human beings, create that sense of togetherness and belonging between us, or indeed divergence or conflict between us, and starting to understand those. So where there may be cultural definitions or geographical definitions, I think it's a great place to start, to try and understand what do we mean by those terms, and what impact do they have on us in our everyday working lives.
Anna Nielsen says, part of the problem I see is what we've been talking about. HR seems like it is differentiated from the rest of the organization, like some alien. And the perceived power differences therein create a sense of power over versus power with. This is why part of my work is neutralizing both real and perceived power differences. Now, 2 things here. We could talk a bit about power, because obviously that's a big issue. But the other part seems to me is the trust. And unless we trust the HR function, it's very hard to see how we move forward. Would you like to say a little bit about those 2 things?
I think that's absolutely right. So for me, trust, respect and communication are the 3 component parts here that we need to focus on. And in order to be able to build that trust, to have respect and have good lines of communication, we need to look at what some of the barriers are and some of the challenges, but also what's working well in our organizations. What could HR be doing to reduce that perception that it's an alien, outside of the sort of normal day-to-day running of the organization, and bring them in so they're adding value. You know, the idea of going to see HR is seen as a threat. I'll go and speak to HR. I'll take out a grievance. I'll take out a disciplinary processes. You know, these are they're swords of Damocles. You know, HR. What HR professional went into HR to be described as a sword of Damocles that hangs over every decent, reasonable person's neck? So how do we begin to redefine that? Well, you know, one of the things I would say is you know, is go to our core values. So how can HR help to deliver the values within the organization, becoming an advocate and an ambassador for the organization's purpose and values? Now, we know that the leadership function and management function are helping to deliver those. But if HR were going to be a police or doing something of that nature, then let's police the values. Let's look at how we can make those values a core everyday function within our organizations. How can the HR function, using some of the skills I might use and many of the people on this call as facilitators and enablers, so using skills around principled negotiation rather than positional bargaining, using those skills of mediation, creating a psychologically safe space for people to come together. When there's a management union collective dispute happening, that HR aren't sat on the side of management facing off against the union. HR are sat at the chair of the table, chairing and facilitating a really powerful conversation between these two players using their intrinsic mediation and restorative skills. So rethinking and in essence releasing the HR function from some of those orthodoxies I think that they've just fallen into in 20 or 30 years, releasing themselves from those and actually taking themselves closer to some of those principles we're talking about. You know, coaching again, they see some really powerful work that HR can be doing to deploy a learning culture through coaching conversations. So where we see the HR function acting as a coach and a mediator, supporting managers to have really powerful conversations at a local level to manage change and handle conflict effectively is a huge value add. So now when I go to HR, knocking on the door of HR, asking for support, I know I'm going to have value, it'll be constructive, it's supportive, it's empathetic, it's driving a positive outcome. It's no longer a threat. And what I think that means is I'm going to come to HR earlier. And so I'm more likely to get a resolution closer to source because I've knocked on the HR door at a much earlier stage because I'm going to get a better conversation or a different conversation rather than leave it for 6 months, wait for it to fester, then it blows up, then I go to HR's door and really leave them with very few options other than the formal routes, which we've obviously been talking about.
Perry Timms is kind of supporting your point, I think, David, and he kind of defines HR as a group of professionals attempting to calibrate, committed and enable people with their best work that fulfills an organization's mission and reason for being.
Thank you, Perry. As is often the case with Perry Timms, he puts it so beautifully as very little to say, but no, I would completely concur with everything that Perry's just said there, and it's great to hear from that.
You describe yourself as a lifelong mediator, David, and I wonder how CEOs respond to this and whether mediation is actually part of their job or their skill set, or how they view mediation or any of these issues, really.
Mediation is the most amazing thing. You know, I get bored quite easily, if I'm honest with you, and so I'm always looking for a new challenge. But I never get bored of mediation. It's the most incredible, powerful, rewarding, and satisfying thing, and it's so mired in mystery. It's so misunderstood. I feel deep sense of frustration sometimes when I hear people misunderstanding it, or medication or meditation, or people's just almost brush it off as that's a nice to have over there, but the real tough business happens over here. What is mediation? Mediation is a powerful process of bringing different people together who have opposing views on a particular topic, and those opposing views for one reason or another have fallen over into a set of behaviours which may have caused harm deliberately or otherwise, where people then hold a perception of the other that have created harm. Now, those things can come to loggerheads, or they can be ignored, as we've been talking about. All those individuals can come to the table and have a conversation. Now, the best mediation I could ever do is in absentia. So the best mediation I will ever do is when I'm not in the room, because I've helped to create the systems and the structures that put the space, that create a space for that dialogue to happen. And mediation doesn't have to have a mediator there. It's a principle, it's a mindset, it's a way of coming together, listening, seeking to gain insight, listening for meaning rather than listening to defend, having an open mind to another perspective and truth, sharing my truth in such a way as the other person can respond to it, equalizing our power and recognizing the other person has an equal voice in the environment to seek learning and creative outcomes. That's what the mediator does. Now, when I'm in the room, then what I'm doing is helping the two parties to have that conversation. And it's a powerful conversation because we know that the conflicts and the tensions that we see, they cause people, they can't sleep at night properly. They're feeling ill, they're feeling upset, or worse, as we see in many organizations. So the first thing I see as a mediator is this powerful transformation in the individual. Their shoulders step up, their face seems to change. It's less tired and less fearful and apprehensive. And then they start talking, and at first they can't look at each other and their heads are turned, and then you get this moment where they look at each other and start connecting with each other. Now, these are skills I use as a mediator every day because there is a conflict. Now, it seems a shame to me that we have to use mediation because of a contingent factor, which is a conflict. Can't we be using these skills of bringing people together and then negotiating outcomes, finding outcomes based on my needs and your needs? So there's convergence, seeing where there's different opinions, divergence, and having a conversation about divergence as a source of strengths, taking the adversity out of diversity and creating this space where we can celebrate our differences. And it seems a shame that you have to be in a dispute or a conflict in order to mediate. So to your question about, is it a leadership capability? I would say it's one of the most important leadership capabilities. Bringing people together who have opposing or different views over whatever it is, in order for people to share those opposing views to reach some convergence and commonality, in order that together you can then move forward with those insights, that innovation and that creativity. And if leaders are able to do that in our organizations, whether it's a merger or an acquisition, being able to bring those two functions together and create alignment between two cultures so they can synergize and be the most brilliant versions of themselves, or at an individual level between two departmental heads or other employees in the organization. That is the power of leadership. And I would argue, and vehemently argue, that mediation skills, the skills we use as mediation, could and should be one of the most strategically valuable tools that a leader could be using every day in their toolkit.
Perry Timms, again, I'd be interested in David's take on where HR and ESG sits in the sense of restorative justice, inclusion, dialogue, and accountability for what really matters, and the sense of employee activism, which is a topic that Thinkers50 has been exploring in recent times. So many of the strands come together in this conversation. But and the sense of employee activism as a counterfoil to dogmatic and exclusive operating paradigms, where perhaps their misbehavior is a protest to unfairness. So not at all an interpersonal conflict. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a big question, Perry. So it's a big question. So yeah, let's start with the kind of environmental, social, and governance factors and use of restorative processes within those, and creating a space for them, for us all to contribute. We all have, I mean, we just have to look at our political systems. We just have to look at the climate change, climate emergency. We just have to look at the geopolitical circumstances that we're all living through at the moment to know that we all have a stake in ESG. But is ESG being done to us or with us? So could we be using these conversational tools and restorative processes to create a bigger conversation across our whole workplaces to draw in all of the various views? Now, the challenge, I think, there, and this is where restorative justice can play a really core role, is because as we get all these views coming in, there'll be views that we agree with, there'll be views that we disagree with, and there'll be opposing views which could become conflictual and could become a source of dispute or tension. Restorative justice allows all of those views to be discussed and aired in a safe and constructive way, and the facilitator there, the leadership function within our organisation, is able to manage those opposing views and able to harness them and harness the energy from them. I know you'll like the word energy, Perry. Harness the energy from all of those views and bring them into the organisation. So it's not being done to you; it's being done with you, and that speaks to a previous question about having power over rather than power with. This is power with. Now, the challenge I see in organizations as well with employee activism is people want justice. People are campaigning for justice, whether it's in the US today right now on abortion rights, whether it's about climate change, misogyny, racism, people are challenging the systems around notions of justice and fairness. Bring your whole self to work, we say. Bring your whole you into our workplace. Well, thank you very much, I will. And I'm very concerned about these social matters, and I'm going to have my voice heard. And I'm not really that interested if you're not going to listen to me, because if you won't listen to me, I'll go onto social media. I'll go and speak to others who share my view and we'll form a coalition. So employee activism to me seems to be one of the potentially the most significant drivers of change within our organisations. Leaders, are you ready to listen? We weren't doing a very good job of it before. Are we ready to really listen now? Are we ready to engage these more than this? And again, those restorative principles that I'm talking about allow us to engage our ears, speak less and listen more, create that in space, the psychologically safe space for these conversations to happen, to people to feel heard and valued and that their point of view is being taken on board. People don't expect you to agree with every word they say. That's not the point. The point is, did you hear me? Did you value me? And did you give me an opportunity to have my point of view taken on board? And when leaders and others create the space for that to happen, amazing things can happen with other organizations. But when we suppress it, or where we do not give the appearance we're doing that, I think that's when we see, a storm on social media, which can have significant reputational impact, or worse, probably a slow, inexorable death of 1,000 cuts of a previously very high-performing, good organization. So I think listening, so employee activism, speak up, listen up, and then act. Those three things are critical to how we give voice in our organizations. Listen, speak, act. And I think then we've got a really powerful way of introducing or adopting these restorative principles that I've been talking about today.
Omaladi Simbi Wellington says, what do you make of organizations that don't embrace divergence of opinions? Like they always have a phrase, that's the way we always do it. I mean, that's the reality. That's the depressing reality in so many organizations.
I think there's a paradigm shift happening in our organizations, and the people, there's a labour market. The Great Resignation. People are exiting the labour market. We've always had a labour market. You can, as I read once on a tweet, we're not trees. We can move to other jobs, so we can choose to move. But people are choosing a different lifestyle altogether. So people are choosing to work for organisations which match their needs around values, beliefs, principles, speaking out, leadership, HR functions. So I think the first one would be those organisations who do it that way because they've always done it will start to see a slow shift of talent to their competitors. And of course, you lose the people you want to keep, you keep the people you want to lose. So suddenly you're beginning to drain your talent. Customers are demanding more. Customers every day are demanding more from organisations, and rightly so too. So we start to see our customers then making choices in the competitive marketplace. It's not just price. Clearly, price is a massive issue at the moment, as we're experiencing such a squeeze on price. Price isn't the only factor. It's matching against the customer's expectations around values and beliefs. And of course, investment into our organisations. Where are people going to invest their money? Will they invest their money in the organisations which look like they're stuck in last year, or will they be investing their money in those organisations who are predicting the future and doing a really great job of thinking about what tomorrow might look like? And those are, to me, are three compelling arguments for really starting to think about how we engage with people and how we shift away from the status quo. So, if it ain't bust, don't fix it. But the justice systems in our organisation are bust. It's time for them to be fixed.
Yeah. One of the great things about this conversation is we're pulling together, I said, strands. We championed Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety, which you referenced. Yeah. We're big fans of Megan Rates's work on employee activism and on speaking truth to power. But some of this conversation is also reminds me of an HBR article that Chan Kim and Rennie Moburn wrote donkeys years ago called Fair Process, and they were talking about the fact that in organizations, if there is fair process, if people can see transparently that there is a justice to what happens and how they're treated, it will bring out the best in people. People don't mind necessarily if they can see why something's happened to them and they feel it was just and they were allowed to have a voice and the process was fair. But you said very early on in this conversation, you started talking about competitive advantage.
Mm.
Why can't organizations, I mean, perhaps that they reframe that there probably are organizations that get it, really get it.
Yep.
I mean, fully get
Yes.
it. And they will have, I do believe, they will have a competitive advantage from doing this well. Are there some examples that you can point to? Are there companies or institutions or organizations that we can look to for best practice?
I think there are great many. I mean, I work with numerous organisations to do this stuff. I think we see globally a number of organisations that are doing this stuff really well. And I think it's those organisations that we take inspiration from. And I certainly would be calling for more research, data, and evidence to create the connection between culture, people, purpose, values, and competitive advantage. And I'm not going to sit here right now, Des, and say that I have all of the answers and all of the evidence. But perhaps we do need our academics and our academic institutions and our business schools to start to really begin to evaluate the relationship between these things, because they're tangible and people can feel them. And what I mean by that is, thinking about that competitive advantage, let's think about that from a human perspective. You talked about fair process. If I'm involved in a fair process, I feel I'm being treated fairly. It doesn't matter what the outcome is. If I feel like I'm being treated fairly, I'm going to sleep well that night. If I think you're treating me unfairly, I'm going to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning because I don't feel right. And it's going to wake me up and I'm going to start to work through in my head. How can I get one over on you? How can I gain an advantage over you? And I'll be running this through my head at 2 o'clock, and then I'll be still up at 3. Then I'll go to sleep at 4. Then I've had a bad night's sleep. Then I'll wake up in the morning, probably ping you a rather stroppy email. You come into the office at 5 o'clock or whatever time in the morning, and the day begins in that particular way. So at a very human level, that fair process on this example helps me to get a better night's sleep. I sleep better. I come in that next day. You and I don't have that fiery relationship. I'm more likely to put in discretionary effort. And if you had put 5 minutes discretionary effort in that day because you've not had a dodgy email from me, I do because I've slept better. That's 10 minutes of discretionary effort in that day. An organisation with 10,000 headcount, if every day we could get 5 minutes of discretionary effort because there was less tension, I'd love for someone, there might be someone on this call, who could work out what would that be an aggregate in terms of the amount of hours that we would see put into that organisation. So yes, we're doing some wonderful work. We're doing some great work with Next here in the UK. We've been working with Bloomberg. We've been working with numerous organisations who are doing some really exciting stuff. And there really is a huge list of public and private and governmental organisations. But what I'd love to be able to see is a direct connection between, as I said, that purpose, the values, the behaviours, that relational stuff that we're talking about, and then the competitive advantage in the work in the marketplace. And that to me would be a really interesting piece of research.
And you're just the guy to write that book and do that research. Now, that's a conversation that we had the last time.
I did promise my wife never again.
Is that book any further along? Are you pursuing that?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm on the second edition now of Managing Conflict. So really looking for some more stories and examples to build on those from 2017 of organisations who've done work around integrated conflict management systems, and the approaches that I was advocating in relation to HR systems. So if there's anyone who's doing interesting work and in that space, I'd love to hear from you. The How to Disagree Well book is just in the early stages. I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into that for The Economist. And I'm also thinking about the second edition of Transformational Culture and bringing together more stories from organisations, because it's been fantastic since it was published last year. People have been coming to me every day telling me about the stories of good cultures and unfortunately some toxic and less good cultures. I'm really looking forward to sharing more examples of what good culture looks like and how we can shift away from those toxic and damaging and sometimes divisive cultures to something more purpose driven, fair, just, inclusive, sustainable and high performing.
David, unfortunately, we're out of time. We can complain about the fairness of that, I guess. Really appreciate you joining us today. Really interesting and important conversation. Check out David's work. We strongly recommend his books. They're required reading, especially for anybody in HR, but beyond HR as well. I think these are vital issues. So thank you very much to David Liddle. Please check out his work. Next week, we're going to be joined by Busima Tufik from MIT. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you very much, David.
No, thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Des. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you for having me part of Thinkers50 Radar Class of 22.